In the early 90s, police in southern Germany encounter something eerie. A brutal murder has left little evidence, but investigators make one chilling discovery: the DNA of an unidentified woman. It's not what they expect to find, and it sends ripples through the team. They scan their database, hoping for a match, but their search comes up empty. At this point, the woman is simply a shadow, a mystery. They have no face, no name, just a string of genetic code hinting at a female presence at the scene of an unspeakable crime. Police gather that this DNA might just belong to someone involved, perhaps even the killer herself, but nothing is certain. At the time, they have no way of knowing just how deeply this invisible figure will haunt their investigations. As this DNA evidence begins to reappear in future cases, the legend of the woman without a face is born. She is everywhere yet nowhere, slipping through their fingers as if she's a ghost, leaving only a haunting trace that speaks to the brutality of her possible actions. Years slip by, and the mystery deepens. DNA from the woman without a face is found again and again at scenes that defy any singular pattern. Her DNA shows up on a heroin-laden syringe found in the quiet woods of Germany, adding a dark, narcotic twist to her already bizarre criminal profile. Months later, another match is found on something entirely unexpected: a half-eaten cookie left behind in a ransacked trailer. But she doesn't stop there. Her genetic imprint appears after break-ins across multiple regions and in cases that range from petty theft to violent confrontations. There's no logic, no motive that links her crimes beyond the DNA. She seems to appear out of thin air, only to disappear again, leaving the police grasping at straws. Investigators struggle to reconcile her movements. How could one person be linked to so many places, each crime stranger than the last? The randomness of her targets: a trailer, a burglary, drug paraphernalia, paints a chilling picture. Whoever she is, she appears to be everywhere and nowhere at once, weaving an invisible web of unsolved mysteries that grows more ominous with each passing year. By the early 2000s, the unknown woman's presence has escalated into something of a nightmare for law enforcement. Her DNA continues to appear at crime scenes across Germany, Austria, and France, as if taunting the investigators. No eyewitnesses, no arrests, just the unsettling realization that this figure is still out there, lurking in the shadows. Then, in a tragic turn in Heilbronn, Germany, a violent attack on two police officers adds another shocking entry to her file. It's a calm spring day, and the officers are caught off guard. A brutal assault unfolds in broad daylight. One officer, a young woman, dies from her injuries, while her partner barely survives the ambush. When investigators begin combing through the evidence, they make an alarming discovery. The DNA found on the slain officer matches the elusive woman who's haunted them for over a decade. It's the first time her DNA has been directly linked to the death of a police officer, and the implications shake the team. They know now that this is more than a thief or petty criminal. She's someone capable of unspeakable violence. This turning point leads them to give her a name, one that would come to represent their frustration and fear: the Phantom of Heilbronn. But the new moniker doesn't help them uncover her identity. In fact, it only seems to strengthen the myth surrounding this faceless, ghostly figure, a shadow who has struck fear into law enforcement across Europe. As the police dig deeper, their desperation grows, and with it, the question: who is the Phantom of Heilbronn? News of the Phantom of Heilbronn spreads like wildfire, sparking a wave of panic and intrigue across Europe. Newspapers, radio stations, and television broadcasts latch onto her story, portraying her as a shadowy criminal genius capable of outwitting law enforcement across borders. The Phantom's crimes and the fact that she remains unidentified make her the perfect story for a captivated audience. Whispers of her exploits grow, painting a portrait of a ruthless, cunning mastermind who operates without a trace. The media frenzy transforms her from an enigma into a terrifying legend. Speculation fills the airwaves, with headlines asking whether she's a trained assassin, a spy, or part of an underground network. As each new crime surfaces with her DNA, the stories only become darker and more intense. In households across Germany, Austria, and beyond, families talk about her in hushed tones, wondering if she could strike again. Public fear mounts as the possibility of crossing paths with this invisible specter feels all too real. The Phantom has become more than just a suspect. She's an urban legend, a name that stirs fear and fascination, woven into conversations, whispered as a cautionary tale. And the mystery of who she is, how she's managed to remain invisible for so long, only fuels the fascination. People are desperate for answers, but in the absence of any new leads, the myth of the Phantom of Heilbronn only grows stronger. The search for the Phantom of Heilbronn turns international as authorities in Germany, Austria, and France unite in a desperate attempt to capture this ghostly figure. Each new crime adds to the mountain of evidence bearing her DNA, from break ins to violent confrontations, making her trail seem endless. Across borders, police share files and strategies, hoping to uncover the slightest lead that might shed light on this elusive figure. The sheer volume of cases, now well over 40 linked by her DNA, leaves even seasoned investigators unsettled. But for all their efforts, the Phantom remains just that, a phantom. No one claims to have seen her. Not a single witness has come forward to describe her face, her movements, or her voice. It's as if she's invisible, slipping into and out of crime scenes, leaving only her genetic signature behind. As investigators grapple with her seemingly impossible reach, they start to ask themselves troubling questions. Could they be dealing with a mastermind so skilled that she has learned to move without being seen? Or is there some other explanation, one that none of them dare to consider? With no sightings, no clues beyond her DNA, and no understanding of her motives, the case becomes an obsession. Her presence looms large in police departments across Europe, her legend growing with every unsolved case. The Phantom is everywhere and nowhere, fueling an international pursuit that feels more like a hunt for a ghost than a real human being. Forensics experts across Europe are stumped. Each time the Phantom of Heilbronn strikes, she leaves behind the same DNA, but nothing else, no fingerprints, no hair, no fibers. The consistency of her genetic trace at crime scenes that range from petty thefts to violent confrontations is as baffling as it is unsettling. How could the same woman be responsible for such a wide variety of crimes and yet evade every attempt at tracking her down? Speculation within investigative teams intensifies. Some propose that she must be extraordinarily skilled in evading detection, capable of slipping into and out of these crime scenes without a trace. Others wonder if she is using an entirely new set of methods to cover her tracks, methods that traditional forensic techniques cannot yet detect. Her apparent talent for staying invisible, even as she commits crime after crime, builds an air of dark fascination and frustration among those tracking her. And so, theories emerge, some as strange as the case itself. Could she be part of an underground network of criminals, each member responsible for a single element, using her DNA as a calling card? Or is she simply a master of disguise, a criminal with skills that allow her to outsmart seasoned investigators across three nations? As the case drags on, doubts begin to creep into the minds of even the most experienced officers, feeding the mystery of the woman who seems to leave only one thing behind: the undeniable evidence of her presence, yet never enough to reveal who she truly is. As investigators find themselves tangled in the mystery of the Phantom of Heilbronn, theories begin to take on an almost conspiratorial tone. Some within law enforcement suspect that the Phantom could be a member of an international criminal network, her DNA strategically planted as a means of confusing and taunting police across borders. The consistency with which her genetic traces appear, despite the wide range of crimes and locations, leads to whispers of a larger, shadowy organization operating just out of sight. Is she a hired gun, sent to perform tasks for a crime syndicate that carefully controls each detail of her movements? Or is she perhaps a handler, sending different operatives to commit crimes under the protective cloak of her genetic signature, a single trace that serves as both her identity and her disguise? Such outlandish ideas might sound like fiction, but after years of failed attempts to capture or even glimpse her, the notion of a larger network isn't easily dismissed. The possibility that she could be a small part of a much greater operation, an invisible force orchestrating crimes across Europe, feels chillingly plausible to the investigators. And with no solid leads, they can do little but speculate, trapped in a maze of theories, each one more far fetched than the last. The Phantom, once thought to be a lone figure, now seems to stretch far beyond one woman, a frightening symbol of an unknown power at play. Desperate for a breakthrough, police launch a massive DNA dragnet across Europe, expanding their search to include thousands of potential suspects. It's an unprecedented effort, a coordinated sweep from Germany to France and Austria, with investigators combing through cities, towns, and villages, hoping to capture even a whisper of the Phantom's true identity. DNA samples are taken from individuals who might fit the profile, from petty criminals to known suspects. But one by one, each test returns the same frustrating result: no match. As months turn into years, the Phantom remains just as elusive as ever. Each dead end only deepens the mystery, making it feel as if she's everywhere and nowhere all at once. The international dragnet yields no answers, leaving law enforcement baffled and increasingly on edge. How could a single person evade detection on such a massive scale? With no match to her DNA and no witnesses to speak of, the Phantom's elusiveness becomes legendary. The dragnet only underscores the sheer improbability of her presence, fueling speculation that she's either the most skilled criminal of her time or something altogether different, a ghostly figure slipping through the cracks of the very systems meant to catch her. Despite the unprecedented search, the Phantom remains a shadow, taunting authorities with each uncovered but meaningless trace of her existence. The mystery takes an unsettling turn when the Phantom's DNA is discovered on a slain German police officer's uniform. This officer, who had been killed in an ambush, becomes an unexpected key in the case as forensic specialists find the same DNA profile that had haunted investigators for years. The revelation is chilling. This shadowy criminal, who has evaded capture for so long, might have access to or knowledge of police activities. Speculation runs wild within law enforcement circles. Could she be someone within the police force, a rogue officer, or an informant with ties to officers? Or worse, could she be using contacts inside law enforcement to stay one step ahead? Theories multiply, each one adding a new layer of menace to her profile. The presence of her DNA on an officer's uniform feels like a taunt, a dark sign that she's closer to the police than they could have ever imagined. This disturbing connection fuels fear and frustration among investigators, and some even begin to question their colleagues. For those on the front lines, the idea that the phantom might be one of them, or at least someone with inside knowledge, heightens the paranoia and tension already gripping the case. With this latest twist, the Phantom of Heilbronn shifts from a figure in the shadows to a direct threat, sending ripples of dread through the ranks of those sworn to catch her. As the investigation hinges more and more on DNA, forensic experts begin to notice something odd. No other physical evidence, no fibers, fingerprints, or footprints ever accompanies her genetic trace. Even in cases where items were handled or moved, there is only the ghostly mark of her DNA. Despite advanced methods designed to capture even the faintest clues, nothing beyond her genetic profile ever turns up. The phantom's DNA presence begins to feel almost supernatural. Experts wonder if this shadowy criminal is somehow able to leave behind only a genetic signature, avoiding any other trace that would place her definitively at the scene. The absence of corroborating evidence leaves investigators wrestling with the possibility that they're not just dealing with a master criminal, but with someone or something that defies traditional explanation. The lack of other forensic evidence raises an unsettling question among the investigative team. Is it possible this criminal could somehow plant only DNA, creating a phantom trail with no other link to her existence? As they continue to follow her traces, their doubts begin to grow, and with them, the haunting mystery of whether they're even chasing a real person or the shadow of something else entirely. As the phantom's DNA continues to baffle investigators, some forensic experts begin to harbor quiet suspicions. Could contamination be the real culprit here? The idea is whispered among a few in the lab, an uncomfortable possibility that feels more plausible with each inexplicable DNA finding. Despite the signs pointing to some form of contamination, most experts hesitate to voice these doubts publicly. The story of the Phantom of Heilbronn has taken root too deeply, capturing public imagination and driving an extensive, multinational manhunt. The reluctance to consider error stems partly from the momentum of the case. After years spent tracking her alleged crimes across Europe, admitting to a contamination mistake would be a massive blow to law enforcement credibility. This case has consumed resources, time, and public trust. For authorities, acknowledging the possibility of a forensic error feels almost unthinkable. Admitting they might be chasing an illusion, a ghost created by contaminated DNA, could unravel not just this case, but the very protocols of forensic science. With pressure mounting and public fear still high, these suspicions are kept quiet, drowned out by the louder voices of those who insist the phantom is out there, somewhere, lurking just beyond reach. And so, the investigation pushes forward, committed to finding a woman who may never have existed in the first place. In 2009, the Phantom case takes a shocking turn when forensic investigators stumble upon a detail that defies all logic. During a routine examination of evidence, they discover the Phantom's DNA on the identification papers of a male asylum seeker. This anomaly halts the investigation in its tracks. How could her DNA, a haunting presence tied to over 40 crimes, now appear on documents belonging to a man who couldn't possibly be connected to her past crimes? Investigators scramble to make sense of this baffling discovery. Could it mean the asylum seeker has ties to the Phantom, or even to her network? Or could it suggest something far stranger, that the Phantom's DNA itself may be moving independently of any actual crime? As they consider these questions, some investigators find themselves confronting the very possibility they'd avoided for years: contamination. This revelation forces officials to pause and re examine the evidence collected over the years, considering that the DNA they've been following might not be from a criminal mastermind, but rather the result of a flaw in their very tools. Could it be that a simple error has sent them on a wild chase for a criminal who may not even exist? For the first time, the case feels as if it's unraveling, forcing investigators to confront the terrifying possibility that they've been chasing shadows. After the baffling discovery on the asylum seeker's documents, police are compelled to dig deeper into their own procedures. Their investigation turns to the DNA swabs used in forensic collection, scrutinizing every detail in a last-ditch effort to explain the phantom's inexplicable presence across Europe. The findings are as shocking as the case itself. The cotton swabs used for collecting DNA were never certified for human DNA collection. It turns out these swabs, which had been assumed to be sterile, were only certified for medical use, not for forensic purposes. This critical flaw meant that DNA from the factory workers who handled them could inadvertently transfer onto the swabs, contaminating the samples collected at crime scenes. The realization strikes investigators hard. The so-called phantom wasn't an invisible criminal genius, but an accidental result of flawed forensic equipment, a haunting echo of the DNA from a woman who never committed these crimes. This truth unravels years of work, untangling the myth of the woman without a face and leaving investigators grappling with the implications. For nearly 2 decades, they had chased an illusion, the legacy of a single contaminated DNA source that had quietly crept into investigations, igniting fear and frustration across Europe. As this shocking oversight comes to light, authorities face the uncomfortable task of correcting a massive forensic error, a hidden truth that redefines the very foundations of the case. The unraveling of the Phantom's legend reaches a startling conclusion when investigators trace the DNA back to its origin, a factory in Eastern Europe. Here, a worker, an ordinary woman with no criminal connections, had unknowingly left her DNA on swabs that would later become part of forensic kits distributed across Europe. This single, unintentional act set off a chain reaction, linking her DNA to an array of crime scenes and sparking one of the most complex manhunts in modern history. Forensic experts and police alike are floored by the implications. Years of painstaking investigations, resources, and international cooperation were poured into tracking this phantom figure who, in reality, never existed as a criminal at all. The story of the woman without a face was shattered in an instant, upending everything the police thought they knew about the case. The worker's DNA had woven itself into the fabric of some of Europe's most notorious unsolved crimes, creating a haunting, unintentional myth. This revelation forces authorities to not only re examine years of cases, but also the methods and standards that allowed such contamination to happen. The phantom was, it turned out, a ghost born of a simple error, a mistake hidden in the very equipment meant to bring criminals to justice. In the final twist of a case that spanned nearly 2 decades, investigators unmasked the Phantom of Heilbronn not as a criminal, but as an unintentional phantom born from contaminated forensic equipment. The fearsome figure once suspected of masterminding a string of crimes across Europe is revealed to be nothing more than an innocent presence, her DNA left by accident on swabs handled by a factory worker. This woman, who had no knowledge of the chaos her DNA would cause, inadvertently became the face of countless unsolved crimes, her genetic signature haunting law enforcement for years. This revelation is both a relief and a profound disappointment for investigators. They had spent years, resources, and public trust on a hunt for a ghost, an illusory criminal who never truly existed. The swabs, tainted with the DNA of an unsuspecting worker, had transformed an ordinary woman into a figure of legend, a supposed mastermind lurking in the shadows of every crime scene her DNA touched. The phantom is unmasked at last, not as a person, but as a mistake, an error hidden in the very tools designed to solve crimes. With this realization, the case that once gripped Europe loses its dark allure, leaving only a cautionary tale in its place, a reminder of the consequences when forensic science falls short of perfection. The revelation of the Phantom of Heilbronn as nothing more than a tragic forensic error ignites a storm of outrage. Families of victims whose cases had been tangled in the phantom's web are stunned and furious, demanding answers from the very authorities they had trusted to seek justice. How, they ask, could investigators overlook such a fundamental flaw? How could a contaminated swab slip through years of forensic work, casting doubt on countless cases and stoking fears across Europe? The public response is swift and unforgiving. Accusations of incompetence and negligence flood the media, with critics lambasting the authorities for their failure to recognize the error sooner. News outlets that had once sensationalized the Phantom's story now turned their attention to the mistakes and missteps of law enforcement, scrutinizing every detail of the flawed investigation. Caught in the eye of the storm, police departments and forensic labs scramble to manage the fallout. Officials issue statements attempting to explain how this mistake could happen, but these explanations fall flat in the face of public anger. The scandal reaches far beyond the police force, sparking debates about the reliability of forensic science and the devastating consequences when it falls short. For the families of real victims, the phantom's unmasking feels like betrayal and illusion that took years from them, offering only the hollow promise of answers that never came. With the phantom's identity revealed as nothing more than a tragic mistake, the sense of resolution is far from complete. In fact, the revelation leaves in its wake an unsettling realization. Many of the crimes once attributed to the Phantom of Heilbronn remain unsolved, their true perpetrators still unknown. For the families of victims, this brings a haunting sense of unfinished justice, as the promise of closure is dashed, leaving them with only unanswered questions. Victims, advocates, and families press authorities for answers. With the focus on the phantom having taken center stage for so long, many of these cases saw limited investigation beyond the DNA found on scene, assuming that she was responsible. Now, they demand that law enforcement redirect its efforts toward finding those truly responsible for these crimes. Some fear that the real criminals have escaped justice, overlooked during the years when the Phantom was their only suspect. The revelation shifts the focus back to these cold cases, placing renewed pressure on law enforcement. But the lingering mystery remains: how many real perpetrators evaded detection during the years when the Phantom was the primary suspect? And will investigators be able to solve these cases now, with years of evidence and leads gone cold? For the families, the Phantom's exposure as a myth is bittersweet, a painful reminder of how justice was delayed, and how, even now, the truth remains just out of reach. The exposure of the Phantom of Heilbronn as a tragic misinterpretation born from contaminated DNA swabs sends shockwaves through the forensic community. This revelation makes clear that the systems intended to deliver justice had failed, misdirecting investigations and undermining public trust. In the wake of this scandal, European forensic standards undergo an intense review, with experts recognizing the critical need to prevent such contamination from happening again. The International Organization for Standardization (ISO) steps in, implementing new, stricter protocols specifically for forensic labs. These revised standards require DNA swabs and forensic tools to be manufactured under rigorous conditions, with additional testing and certification steps to ensure that they are free from any human DNA before reaching crime scenes. The new protocols call for comprehensive checks to guarantee the sterility and integrity of all equipment, aiming to eliminate even the slightest chance of contamination. This overhaul represents a monumental shift in forensic science across Europe, driven by the lesson learned from the Phantom case. Labs are now required to implement advanced protocols that were, until then, deemed unnecessary. While these measures help restore some public trust, they serve as a lasting reminder of how a single flaw in the system can ripple outward, creating legends, capturing imaginations, and ultimately steering investigations toward phantom trails. As the dust settles on the Phantom case, experts, critics, and members of the forensic community issue a sobering warning. The case of the Phantom of Heilbronn starkly reveals the dangers of relying solely on DNA evidence, underscoring the importance of balanced, multifaceted investigations. While DNA is a powerful tool, the Phantom's story demonstrates that even this gold standard of forensic science is not immune to errors. Relying exclusively on genetic evidence without corroborating it with eyewitness accounts, alibis, or other tangible clues had set investigators on a decade long chase after a ghost. The case becomes a cautionary tale for law enforcement worldwide, serving as a reminder that no single piece of evidence can provide a complete picture. The Phantom's legend illustrates that forensic investigations must always approach cases holistically, using DNA as one part of a larger mosaic rather than the sole determinant. In the aftermath, the lesson rings clear. DNA, while powerful, is not infallible and should never stand alone in the pursuit of truth. To this day, the Phantom of Heilbronn serves as an enduring symbol of forensic fallibility. Her existence may have been a myth, a spectral figure born from a single, overlooked contamination, but her impact is real and lasting. Her story reshaped forensic protocols, sparking reforms across Europe and inspiring rigorous new standards that continue to influence forensic science today. Her legacy haunts crime labs, a constant reminder of how quickly confidence in science can spiral into error. For forensic investigators, her tale is a ghostly guide, a reminder that no technology or evidence, no matter how seemingly ironclad, should ever go unquestioned. Though the woman without a face may have been unmasked as a phantom, her influence lingers a cautionary shadow that investigators won't soon forget.